The Gulf of Oman. April 19th, just past midnight Iran Standard Time, a 965-foot Iranian-flagged cargo ship is moving at 17 knots toward the port of Bandar Abbas. Her name is Touska. On the horizon, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer has been tracking her for 6 hours. The USS Spruance, DDG-111, homeported in San Diego. Her crew has issued warning after warning on bridge-to-bridge radio. Stand down, reverse course. The Tusca has not answered. Above the water, an MH-60R helicopter is already turning. Below it, 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit boarding teams are staging on the flight deck of the USS Tripoli. At 0:12 local time, the captain of the Spruance gives the order. The 5-inch Mk-45 gun opens fire. Oil futures jump 7% before Asian markets open. But everyone is focused on the gun. Nobody is asking the harder question: why this ship? Here is why. To understand what happened in the Gulf of Oman, you have to go back exactly 7 weeks. February 28, 2026. U.S. and Israeli forces launched joint strikes on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. Enrichment sites, command nodes, air defense batteries that had been quietly upgraded over the previous year. The scale of the operation is larger than any single strike Washington had run against Iran before. And Tehran understands inside 48 hours that this is not a one-night message. Tehran answers in the only way it has ever credibly threatened to answer. It closes the Strait of Hormuz. Within days, Iranian gunboats begin firing on commercial tankers. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy begins planting naval mines along the southern lane of the strait. This is the move U.S. planners had wargamed for 2 decades. On paper, it was always the worst-case option for Tehran because mining the strait is not a warning. It is a commitment. Mines do not discriminate. They stay in the water. By March 10th, U.S. military intelligence confirms mine-laying operations are underway. The U.S. military destroys 16 Iranian mine layers in the first countermine sweeps. MH-60S, helicopters operating off U.S. destroyers. Surface engagements at close range. CENTCOM does not publish the casualty figures. Inside a week, the tempo of the conflict has changed. Western crews begin refusing to enter the strait. Insurance markets in London start pricing Gulf transits at war zone rates for the first time since the 1980s tanker war. Roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. 20 million barrels a day. Around $600 billion worth of energy per year, moving through a waterway that is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. By mid-March, Brent crude spikes from $61 per barrel to over $118. It is the largest oil supply disruption in recorded history. Larger than the 1973 embargo. Larger than the 1979 revolution shock. Japan activates emergency reserves within 72 hours. South Korea follows. The European Union issues a joint statement calling for immediate de-escalation. Then comes the twist nobody expected. Iran does not simply close the strait. Iran begins charging tolls. Ships that want to pass are quietly told to pay. The channel is through intermediaries in Dubai and Muscat. Some reports put the figure at over $2 million per vessel. Transfers are routed through third country accounts. Cargoes move only after the money clears. Tehran is not just blocking global oil. It is monetizing it. This is the part almost no one is saying clearly. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is not a shipping crisis. It is not an oil crisis. It is the first modern war in which one nation has tried to turn a maritime choke point into a revenue stream. By April 12th, peace talks in Islamabad between Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian officials collapse. Reports out of Pakistan suggest the final sticking point was not nuclear. It was the tolls. Tehran refused to stop collecting. The next day, President Trump announces a full U.S. naval blockade of Iranian ports. CENTCOM makes it operational within 18 hours. Every ship entering or leaving an Iranian port is now subject to interdiction. In the first 6 days, 25 commercial vessels turn around without incident. Then the Touska sails in. Here is the problem the Spruance was built to solve. A blockade only works if it is enforced. In enforcing a blockade against a nation-state's own flagged vessels in international waters, on the edge of active combat, that is one of the hardest tactical problems in modern naval operations. Start with the geography. The Strait of Hormuz runs between Iran and Oman, at its narrowest point, 21 miles. 2 unidirectional shipping lanes, each only 2 miles wide. Any U.S. warship enforcing a blockade near that strait is operating inside the range of Iranian anti-ship missiles based in Bandar Abbas, the exact port the Tusca was steaming toward. Iranian Nor and Qatar missiles have an effective range of over 120 miles. That means from the moment a U.S. destroyer positions for interdiction, it is already inside a missile engagement zone. Now layer in the target. The Touska is not a warship. She is a 294-meter container ship, nearly as long as a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, weighing roughly 60,000 tons fully loaded. She cannot be boarded at speed. She cannot be rammed. She cannot be disabled with small caliber fire. And she cannot be sunk, because sinking a cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman creates an environmental disaster and an international incident at the same time. This is where the physics takes over from the politics. To stop a 60,000-ton vessel moving at 17 knots, you need to do one specific thing. You need to disable her propulsion without breaching her hull below the waterline. The engine room sits above the waterline on vessels of this class. It is the one spot you can hit with a heavy naval gun and still keep the ship afloat long enough to board her. That is why the USS Spruance was the ship chosen. Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, 9,700 tons displacement. Armed with a 5-inch Mk-45 Mod 4 naval gun, the exact weapon designed for precision surface engagements at ranges up to 13 nautical miles. The Mk-45 fires a 70-pound shell. At close range, it can punch through an engine room bulkhead without cracking the ship in half. The Touska was a freight train the size of a skyscraper. The Spruance had to stop it without derailing it. That is not a political decision. That is a ballistics problem. The Tusca interdiction did not involve one ship. It involved a complete tactical package that had been positioning in the Arabian Sea for weeks. First, the USS Spruance, DDG-111. Flight 2, a Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, commissioned in 2011. 9,700 tons displacement. Primary role on this mission, shooter. She also carries 96 vertical launch cells capable of firing Standard Missile-6 interceptors and Tomahawk cruise missiles. If Iran had responded with anti-ship cruise missiles during the interdiction, the Spruance was also the first line of defense against them. Second, the USS Tripoli, LHA-7, America-class amphibious assault ship, commissioned in 2020. This is the platform that made the boarding possible. The Tripoli carries the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit plus MV-22B Ospreys and MH-60 helicopters for vertical insertion. She is essentially a light aircraft carrier purpose-built for expeditionary operations, exactly like this one. Third, the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. The MEU, approximately 2,200 Marines trained specifically for visit, board, search, and seizure operations. VBSS in Navy terminology. These are the teams that rappel from helicopters onto moving or disabled ships, clear the bridge, secure the engine room, and take custody of the crew. VBSS is not a combat doctrine. It is a policing doctrine executed under combat conditions. Fourth, overhead ISR, U.S. Navy Boeing. P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft had been tracking the Touska from the moment she departed her previous port. The Spruance did not find the Touska. The P-8S handed her off. 5 assets, 1 interdiction, every one of them required. Now look at this from Tehran's side, because the Iranian response to the blockade is more sophisticated than it looks. Iran's stated position is that the blockade is illegal. Its National Security Council has called it an act of piracy. Iranian state media threatened retaliation within hours of the Tusca seizure. On the surface, this looks like rhetoric. It is not only rhetoric. The Iranian doctrine for the Strait of Hormuz is called asymmetric denial. It does not rely on sinking U.S. warships. It relies on making the cost of keeping warships in the strait higher than the cost of letting Iran through. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy operates hundreds of fast attack craft, swarm boats, anti-ship cruise missile batteries hidden in coastal caves, and naval mines. Iran cannot win a fleet engagement. It does not need to. It only needs to make every U.S. transit expensive enough that the political will to keep enforcing breaks first. And this is where Iran's calculation gets interesting. The Tusca was not a random ship. According to CENTCOM, she was already under U.S. Treasury sanctions for a history of illegal activity. She was also reportedly carrying cargo with links to Chinese buyers. By pushing her through the blockade, Tehran was testing whether Washington would actually shoot. If the Spruance had hesitated, even once, the entire blockade loses credibility and dozens of sanctioned Iranian vessels start running it within days. That is why the shot had to happen. Not because the ship was uniquely dangerous, because the blockade was being tested, and a blockade that is not enforced is not a blockade. Here's the part of the story that got almost no coverage. The Spruance did not open fire immediately. CENTCOM confirmed the destroyer issued warnings for 6 full hours before firing a single round. 6 hours. That is not caution. That is a deliberate tactical window designed to do 3 things simultaneously. First, it let the Tusca's crew evacuate her engine room. CENTCOM was very specific. The destroyer directed the vessel to evacuate the engine room before firing. Iran's military later confirmed its forces did not resist the boarding because the crew's families had already been identified. The Spruance shot to disable. It did not shoot to kill. Second, it created a legal record. Every radio warning over those 6 hours is logged, time-stamped, and recorded. When China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs called the action dangerous and irresponsible the next day, the U.S. response was already on the table. 25 commercial vessels had been turned around peacefully. The Tusca was the one that refused. Third, it broadcast the doctrine. Every other Iranian-flagged vessel in the Gulf watched this happen in real time. The message was not, "We will sink you." The message was, "We will give you 6 hours. We will tell you to leave your engine room, and then we will disable you and take your ship." This is how modern blockade enforcement works. Not with a single decisive strike. With a 6-hour clock and a gun. So now the question is, what happens next? Because the Tusca is in U.S. Marine custody. The blockade is still live, and Iran has already called this piracy. There are 3 scenarios that reasonable analysts are looking at. The first is the Islamabad breakthrough. President Trump has announced that a U.S. delegation is on its way to Pakistan for renewed peace talks. If Tehran decides the cost of the blockade is higher than the political cost of a deal, Iran formally reopens the Strait of Hormuz, drops the toll scheme, and allows international traffic to resume under normal freedom of navigation rules. In exchange, the U.S. lifts the blockade and the Tusca is released. Oil prices drop back towards $70 per barrel. The war ends, not with a ceasefire, but with a negotiated maritime settlement. This scenario requires Iran to absorb a visible defeat. That is not impossible, but it is not guaranteed. The second is the gray zone. This is the scenario that should concern you most, not because it is the most violent, but because it is the most likely, and it is the hardest to exit. In the gray zone, the blockade continues. Iran does not formally escalate, but it does not back down either. A few ships run the blockade every week. The Spruance and her sister destroyers continue to fire warning shots, disable engine rooms, and board vessels. The strait is technically open, but functionally closed. Oil prices stabilize around $90 per barrel. Shipping insurance premiums stay at war zone rates indefinitely. China and India continue buying Iranian oil through intermediaries. The blockade becomes permanent because neither side has an off-ramp. This is how modern conflicts actually end now. Not with a peace treaty. With a slow, expensive stalemate that drains both sides for years. The third is the escalation, the worst case. Iran decides the Tusca seizure is a line that cannot go unanswered. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launches coordinated anti-ship missile strikes on U.S. destroyers operating near the strait. Or it uses swarm boats to attempt to board a Western tanker. Or it sinks a blockade-running ship of its own to create a casualty event and blame the U.S. Any one of these pulls the United States back into direct combat with Iran. The 2-week ceasefire that is barely holding right now collapses. Airstrikes resume against Iranian power plants and infrastructure. Exactly what President Trump threatened on April 18th. Oil hits $130 a barrel. The region goes into open war. Back to the Gulf of Oman, back to the Tusca, drifting with a hole in her engine room, Marines now walking her decks. This is the thesis. The U.S. Navy did not shoot the Tusca because the Tusca was dangerous. The U.S. Navy shot the Tusca because a blockade that hesitates is not a blockade. Every other Iranian-flagged vessel in the region was watching. The shot was not tactical. The shot was doctrinal. And here is the reframe. 6 hours of warnings. A gun designed to disable, not to sink. A boarding by Marines who did not fire a single round once they were aboard. A crew that walked off her decks alive into Marine custody with their families identified and their names logged. This was not an act of war. This was an act of enforcement, delivered with the precision of peacetime in the middle of an undeclared one. The Spruance is still on station in the Gulf of Oman. The Tripoli is still forward deployed. The 31st MEU is still staging on her flight deck. Somewhere on the water, another Iranian captain is watching his radar, watching his radio, watching the clock on the horizon that is not his clock anymore. The blockade is live. The doctrine is public. The precedent is set. The Touska was the test. The next ship is the answer.